It didn't look like a conspiracy. It looked like a mistake. But mistakes like this don't happen by accident. My name isn't important. I'm not a journalist, not a politician. I'm an analyst, the kind of person who notices things, patterns, inconsistencies, the kind of person who reads too much between the lines and not enough of the headlines. It started with a letter, no return address, no stamp, just my name, written in black marker. Inside, a single sheet of yellowing paper, typed, old school, like from a typewriter. No logo, no signature, no instructions, just a list of names, and next to them, dates. Some of the names were immediately recognizable. Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Gerald Ford, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, Alfred Heineken. Next to each name, a series of years, some of them decades apart. One entry stood out. Kissinger, 1954, 1973, 1992, 2010. I frowned. I knew Kissinger was active in geopolitics for decades. But 1954? That early? That year rang a bell. Not because I remembered it, but because I'd come across it in old archives. One of those obscure references people scroll past without noticing. That was the year of the first Bilderberg meeting, a private gathering held in a hotel of the same name in the Netherlands. And every single name on that list had ties to that event, or to one of the dozens that followed. There was no official header, no watermark, but in the bottom right corner, something was typed in bold, slightly misaligned font, /00-01. I had no idea what it meant. A file code, a designation, a joke. But the longer I stared at it, the more it unnerved me. Because one thing was clear. This list wasn't public. These names weren't supposed to be together. And I had no idea why someone would want me to see it. I started digging. Not deep. Not at first. Just Googling names, dates, crossing events. At first it looked like a coincidence, maybe even nonsense. But then the patterns emerged. Several people from the list were present, unofficially, during the oil crisis talks in the 1970s. Others had ties to biotech firms that spiked years before COVID. One had been involved in shaping global trade policy before any of it became law. Every time a global shift happened, one or more of these names were already there, often in roles that weren't part of public government, but that influenced everything behind it. I contacted a former NATO archivist I knew. We'd studied together. He retired to Greece. Quiet guy. Trusted him. I sent him a photo of the list. He replied in under an hour. "This isn't fake," he wrote. "The formatting, the language, it matches something I saw in a restricted document from the 70s. Same code name, power. That word didn't refer to electricity or energy. It was a header, a classification, and I only saw it once." He added, it was on a planning memo for what they called consensus stability mapping. Basically, determining how to guide regions politically and economically before governments even drafted policies. It was stamped, not for foreign intelligence use. Meaning, it didn't belong to any single nation. That was the last message I ever received from him. 2 days later, his Telegram account was gone. Phone, disconnected. Even our chat history disappeared, replaced by a blank page. No account deleted. No user blocked. Just wiped. By then, I knew what I was dealing with. Not a club. Not a conspiracy. Something else. Something that sits above. I backed up everything. Screenshots. Emails. A full scan of the letter. Offline storage. Printed copies. Hidden locations. Because I wasn't sure if I had days or hours. And I knew one thing. If I disappeared, someone had to know where it began. It began with a yellowing sheet of paper, no signature, a list of names that should never be on the same page, and one final line, /00-01. Once I had the letter, I couldn't ignore the name that kept coming up. Bilderberg. Not a person. A hotel. In a small town in the Netherlands, where in 1954, something happened that no one talks about, but which the world hasn't stopped feeling since. Officially, it was called a private meeting. Just a few politicians and business leaders getting together to discuss Europe's future. Unofficially, it was the beginning of something far more organized and far less democratic. The first meeting took place in Oosterbeek, in the Hotel de Bilderberg. That's where the name comes from. Among the guests, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, former Nazi party member, by the way, Joseph Riedinger, a political fixer with ties to multiple intelligence agencies, Paul van Zeeland, former Prime Minister of Belgium, and a handful of bankers, oil executives, and foreign policy advisors. No journalists, no official minutes, no public statement. Just one rule: absolute secrecy. At first, the stated goal sounded harmless: to foster dialogue between Europe and North America. That's what it says on the official website now, decades later. But when you look at what happened after 1954, the story starts to bend. Just 1 year later, in 1955, France began shifting toward deeper European integration. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome was signed, laying the foundation for the European Union. Every step of that process involved people who attended Bilderberg. Coincidence? Maybe. Until you realize that every major geopolitical shift over the next 5 decades, from the Euro to the Iraq War, had representatives from Bilderberg sitting quietly in the background. Not politicians making decisions, but the ones who briefed the decision makers. And here's where it gets strange. The Bilderberg meetings aren't secret in the tabloid sense. They're not held underground or in bunkers. In fact, every year, someone posts a guest list. But that's where the transparency ends. Because what happens inside those rooms stays there. No recording, no transcripts, no binding resolutions. Just the most powerful people in finance, energy, tech, media, and politics, spending 3 days together behind closed doors. What are they talking about? No one knows, except the consequences speak louder than the silence. In 2002, journalist John Ronson was briefly allowed near the perimeter of a Bilderberg meeting. He described it like approaching a fortress. Armed guards, blocked roads, blacked-out cars, nervous staffers. And when he tried to ask officials what the group actually does, he got the same answer, over and over. It's just a forum for discussion. We don't make decisions. It's not that important. But if that were true, why do billionaires, prime ministers, and kings keep showing up? The narrative was falling apart because I found something buried in an old diplomatic memo, an internal report by a U.S. State Department official who attended a Bilderberg meeting in 1966. It wasn't public. It was declassified by accident, and the memo read, "While no formal vote was taken, the direction of consensus was clear. The strategic outlook expressed in the room is expected to shape national policy in the months to come." Wait, what? A private meeting of unelected individuals shaping national policy? And that wasn't a journalist saying it. It was a U.S. diplomat. That's when I realized Bilderberg isn't a group. It's a filter, a place where global directions are pre-agreed before they're ever debated in Parliament, Congress, or the media. And the ones who sit at that table, they don't run for office. They don't give interviews. They don't want to be seen. So the real question isn't, what does Bilderberg do? The real question is, what decisions are being made before we ever get a chance to vote? At first, I thought it was just a list. One-time connections, nothing more. But the more I looked, the more I noticed the same names appearing again and again and again. Not just over years, over decades, different roles, different industries, but the same surnames, the same family dynasties, the same faces aging but not disappearing. It started with a simple spreadsheet. I plugged in the guest lists from every Bilderberg meeting I could find, from 1954 to now. Some years were missing, some names were redacted, but enough remained. Then I cross-referenced those names with major global financial institutions, government cabinet positions, defense contractors, media conglomerate boards, and suddenly the same dozen names were lighting up. Not just once, not twice, but 5, 10, 15 times. Henry Kissinger, he was at Bilderberg in 7 different decades. 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. David Rockefeller, attended for over 30 years straight. George Soros, Christine Lagarde, Peter Thiel, Jared Kushner, all appeared in recent years, some more than once, despite never holding elected office. But it didn't stop with individuals. I noticed something else. Entire families were being passed through this system. A father attends Bilderberg in the 80s. His son appears on the list in the 2000s. Then a cousin, a nephew, a spouse. The torch isn't just passed, it's protected. Take the Agnelli family in Italy, founders of Fiat. They were at Bilderberg in the 60s and 70s. Their descendants now run holding companies that own parts of media, auto, banking, and still attend meetings. Or the Belgian Davignon family, with ties to both European Union architecture and multiple Bilderberg steering committees. Or the Rothschilds. Yes, I know. The moment you mention that name, people roll their eyes. Conspiracy. Cliché. But here's the thing. It's not a conspiracy if the data confirms it. And the Rothschild presence in Bilderberg isn't a theory. It's documented. Multiple years. Multiple members. I even found a leaked note from a British politician, dated 1991. He had attended a Bilderberg meeting, then briefed a private colleague. The note read, "It's remarkable how the same families keep reappearing. Everyone plays musical chairs, but the table stays the same." That line hit me. The table stays the same. Because that's what this is. Not a network, not a forum, a table. Same shape, same placement, same bloodlines. The media will tell you. There's nothing secretive here. These are just influential people talking openly. But the rotation doesn't lie. The same last names rise again and again. The same industries. The same decisions that follow their conversations. And none of it is democratic. You don't get to vote for a Rockefeller, or a Kissinger, or a Rothschild. They don't need your vote. They already have the influence. They don't need power. They need access. And Bilderberg is the gateway. And now I understood why that word, power/00-01, was stamped on that document. Because it wasn't a title. It was a category, a classification, a label for those who pass through. And once they do, they don't come back the same. They don't need to come back, because now they're on the inside. By now, I had a list of names, a pattern of appearances, a system that rotated influence through generations. But something was still missing. It wasn't just about who was there. It was about what happened afterward. I took the full archive of known Bilderberg meetings, year by year, and lined them up next to major world events, wars, economic shifts, currency collapses, tech breakthroughs, trade agreements, even pandemics. And that's when the pattern hit me like a freight train. 1965, Frankfurt, Germany. Topic: Global Economic Strategy. What followed? By 1967, the British pound crashed. Sterling was devalued, and the first seeds of a unified European currency were planted. No official link, no announcement, but multiple attendees from central banks, oil conglomerates, and European commissions were present. 1973, Saltsjöbaden, Sweden. Oil executives, OPEC advisors, U.S. Treasury observers. 6 months later, the oil crisis. Gas prices quadrupled, the Middle East fractured, and Western economies plunged into stagflation. Again, no statement from Bilderberg, but the guests had been warned, and their portfolios adjusted accordingly. 1991, Baden-Baden, Germany. Attendees, rising political stars, economic planners. One of them, Bill Clinton. The next year, he was the Democratic nominee. The year after that, President of the United States. Coincidence or initiation? 2008, Chantilly, Virginia. On the guest list, top bankers, hedge fund managers, Federal Reserve insiders. 3 months later, global financial collapse. But guess who got bailouts? Banks with direct ties to Bilderberg participants. Guess who didn't? You. This wasn't about meetings. It was about foreknowledge, a kind of soft power that didn't make events happen, but always seemed to move slightly ahead of them. Even in the COVID era, some Bilderberg alumni had early access to vaccine investment, medical infrastructure contracts, surveillance tech. No official involvement, But the gains were enormous. They didn't need to start the fire. They just showed up with buckets of water before anyone else knew there was smoke. That's when I understood. Bilderberg isn't about decisions being made. It's about decisions being aligned. The meeting is a rehearsal. The press conference comes months later. By then, it's already too late. A document I found, dated 1984, called this dynamic consensus without consent. A phrase that chilled me. It meant policies that never needed a vote, because everyone in power had already agreed behind closed doors. Let me be clear. No laws were broken. No constitution shredded. No coup staged. And that's what makes it so perfect. It's not a conspiracy. It's a choreography. And the public? We're not part of the dance. We're just watching the performance. When you hear about a new world order, it doesn't arrive with soldiers. It arrives with a handshake. And the plan is signed before you even knew there was a plan. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you voted for central banker? Or for the head of NATO? Or for the CEO of BlackRock? You didn't. And yet somehow, they make decisions that shape your entire life. Taxes, interest rates, military deployments, digital ID frameworks, even what you see and don't see online. You never voted for any of that, but someone did, just not in public. The deeper I looked, the more it became obvious. There's the world we see, and the world where choices are made. The second one has no ballot boxes, just conference tables. And Bilderberg? It's not just one of those tables. It's the main one. Former insiders have hinted at it for decades, carefully, cautiously, and often anonymously. A leaked quote from a 1978 attendee, later confirmed to be from a senior EU official, stated, "This is not a discussion. It's a calibration. We're aligning intentions, not opinions." Another, more recent leak, 2014, said this, "Bilderberg is not about policy creation. It's about syncing the clocks of those who already run things." And when you start connecting the names, you realize that the club includes sitting prime ministers, former presidents, heads of IMF, World Bank, ECB, editors-in-chief of major newspapers, billionaire technologists, private intelligence contractors, and they all meet in secret, once a year. No press, no transcripts, no oversight. If that's not a parallel government, what is? They don't control one country. They don't need to. They influence the global consensus. They shape what governments consider inevitable. So that when your elected leader returns home, they're already aligned with what was discussed, even if they never fully understood where the idea came from. I started calling it the shadow consensus, a silent agreement among power players across countries, industries, and ideologies, who don't need to meet often, just enough to stay synchronized. They don't need to agree on everything, just enough to keep the machine moving. And here's the genius of it. They don't issue laws. They issue narratives. And narratives are far more powerful, because you don't need to enforce them. You just need people to repeat them. Take climate policy, or war funding, or pandemic response, or digital currencies. Before any of these became public debates, they were already private agreements, not mandates, not orders, just coordination. And when enough powerful people start saying the same thing, using the same language, pushing the same idea, that idea becomes reality. Not because you wanted it, but because no one questioned it in time. So no, Bilderberg doesn't govern like a king. It governs like a metronome, setting the tempo, so the rest of the world can fall in line. That signature, power/00-01, kept haunting me. It didn't look like a date. It didn't match any file number format I could find. And it definitely wasn't a name. It looked military, coded, purposefully vague. So I searched. Every open archive, every document leak, every intelligence dump from the last 50 years. Nothing. No direct match. But then I found a trace, not in words, but in structure. It came from a Cold War-era NATO memo, partially declassified in 2006. Buried in a footnote was a reference to an internal project codenamed Continuity of Strategic Influence. The memo described it as a framework, not a task force. No command chain, no central office, Instead, it referenced a distributed influence lattice, a network of nodes that could coordinate decisions across institutions without ever issuing direct orders. And the header on that document? Faint, red, and barely legible in the scan. Class power. That was the moment I realized something. Power wasn't a title. It was a category, a level of access, or more precisely, a circle of trust. Not in a legal sense, not even in a classified intelligence sense, but in an informal, elite-level consensus mechanism. It works like this. A handful of individuals, carefully selected, rarely public, are looped into a nonverbal alignment process. They don't sign papers. They don't hold offices, but they're present. They receive the briefings. They hear the direction before the rest of the world does. They're not even members. They're vectors, carriers of influence between institutions. Here's what made it darker. Another document, a leak from a private defense contractor, described a concept called invisible architecture. It read, formal governance is visible. Structural power is not. Influence is mapped through behavioral convergence, not enforcement. In plain English, if everyone at the top starts acting the same way, even without being told, it's because they've already absorbed the signal. That's what power is. It's not a group. It's not a cult. It's not a cabal. It's a protocol, a way of syncing direction across governments, banks, media, tech, without ever creating a trail. And once you're inside it, you don't get orders. You just understand what's expected. You internalize it. One more thing. I found an old letter from a former diplomat, never published, but archived online by a small history blog. It was written in 1989. The Berlin Wall had just fallen, and at the end of the letter, the diplomat wrote, "History will say it was the people who brought down the wall. But I know better. It was already decided. Months earlier, in the mountains, in a meeting without minutes, where a handful of men in suits agreed it was time. Signed as always. Power." Now I was sure. This word wasn't symbolic. It was operational. It marked a moment, a presence, a shift, not in headlines, in alignment. The most powerful organization in the world doesn't have a name. It has a format, and that format starts with power/00-01. I kept going back to the timeline. Bilderberg meetings, one after another, every year, in different cities, behind closed doors. No media, no records, no statements, just a list of dates, a list of names, and a vague location. But something started to emerge, not from what was said, but from what happened after. I took the timeline of every Bilderberg meeting I could find, from 1954 to today, and I compared it side by side with key global events: wars, currency collapses, leadership changes, military interventions, mass surveillance rollouts, technological breakthroughs, and I realized something chilling. Before every major global turning point, there was a meeting, and not just somewhere near that point, often in the same city. Let me show you what I mean. 1999, Sintra, Portugal. Bilderberg meets in a luxury resort outside Lisbon. On the guest list, defense ministers, future NATO leadership, oil executives, telecommunications giants. 3 months later, the Kosovo War escalates. NATO begins its first major military intervention without UN approval. The same officials reappear in news conferences, now with press credentials, but they had already met before the decision. 2001, Stenungsund, Sweden. Meeting agenda: global strategic alignment. Guests included cyber defense analysts and senior national security advisors. 3 months later, 9/11, followed by the Patriot Act. The global surveillance architecture begins to expand. Same attendees reappear, now in charge of shaping the response. 2002, Chantilly, Virginia. Meeting held just outside D.C., right before plans for Iraq are formalized. Defense contractors in attendance, private energy consultants, senior British and American officials. Within a year, the Iraq War begins. 2008, Chantilly again. Same hotel, same pattern. 3 months later, Lehman Brothers collapses. The global economy spins into freefall. Meanwhile, major financial players who attended the meeting, they hedge positions. They walk away protected. Everyone else, destroyed. And then there are the disappearances. Some people appear on the Bilderberg list once, and then never again. Sometimes it's harmless, but in more than one case, the trail simply vanishes. Take the case of a European central banker in 1997. He attended, gave no interviews, then quietly resigned a year later. No public reason given, never returned to public life. Or a tech CEO in 2013, known for strong anti-surveillance views, attended that year's meeting. 2 months later, company sold. He vanished from the public eye. You could call it burnout. You could call it coincidence. But the pattern is too clean, too consistent. Attend once, disappear. Attend twice, pivot. Attend often, and you rise. And if you rise quietly, even better. The deeper I went, the more it felt like choreography. Like someone was staging world events not through speeches, but through proximity. The right people in the right room at the right time. And all they needed was 3 days. 3 days to agree, before the rest of us are even told what the options are. 3 days to write a future and walk away like it just happened. You think change comes from revolution? No, it comes from meetings. And these meetings don't happen in public. It was just a hotel, a quiet, upscale property in the Dutch countryside, tucked between trees, modest by today's standards. Hotel de Bilderberg, Oosterbeek, Netherlands. But in May of 1954, something happened there that would echo through the next 70 years, without ever being officially recorded. The guest list was private. But over time, pieces leaked out. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, Joseph Riedinger, a Polish political advisor with deep ties to Western intelligence, Paul van Zeeland, former Belgian PM, Dean Rusk, U.S. State Department, leaders from Shell, Unilever, Lizard, and Barclays, senior figures from NATO, MI6, and the CIA. No press, no observers, just the most powerful men in Europe and America, sharing a weekend behind closed doors. There was no press release, no transcripts, only one official line, sent months later to justify it, to promote Atlantic cooperation and understanding. That was it. But if it was just a meeting, why was everything about it treated like classified intel? Multiple attendees were flown in on private planes. Security was coordinated with both Dutch police and Western military intelligence. Staff were vetted, rooms swept, telephones disabled. It wasn't just secrecy, it was containment. And it worked, because even now, nearly no one knows what was said in that room. But we know what happened after. Within 5 years, the Treaty of Rome is signed. Europe begins its first steps toward economic union. Within 10 years, NATO's structure shifts toward full-spectrum coordination. Intelligence sharing becomes automatic. Private corporations begin working across borders as if governments no longer exist. And the people making those decisions? Almost all attended that first meeting. You could say it was coincidence, a convergence of history, but that assumes history moves on its own. What if it doesn't? I came across a fragment, a scanned letter from Riedinger to Prince Bernhard, dated 1955. It was never meant to be public. One line stood out. It is not the opinions that matter, but the alignment. Once the alignment is there, the direction becomes inevitable. That word again, alignment. We've heard it over and over. In corporate language, in diplomacy, in global summits. But here, in this letter, it felt surgical, strategic, almost like he wasn't describing a conversation, but an operation. There's a term in systems theory, initial condition bias. It means that the earliest state of a system, no matter how small, has a disproportionate effect on the future. It sets the rules, the boundaries, the expectations, and that hotel, that meeting, was the initial condition for the modern world order. The architecture of power today, supranational institutions, global banks, coordinated media messaging, all trace back, directly or indirectly, to people who passed through that first room. Not just once, but again and again. Even the name stuck. Bilderberg wasn't just a location. It became a code word, a myth, a warning, a marker. Are they Bilderberg? Is this part of the Bilderberg plan? He's Bilderberg level. You hear it whispered in think tanks, among journalists, even within corporate boardrooms. They'll tell you it's paranoia, that it means nothing. But if it truly meant nothing, why did they guard it so well? Why does a simple hotel gathering in 1954 still trigger red flags in classified search engines? Why do journalists lose access credentials after simply mentioning it in articles? Why does the official Bilderberg website contain no full archive, no quotes, no agendas? Because it wasn't a one-off. It was a launchpad, not for a group, but for a format, the kind where decisions aren't made. They're aligned, then scattered into 100 institutions, each carrying out a piece of the puzzle, without ever knowing the whole. It began in a hotel room, with polished wood, muted lighting, polite nods, and no cameras. No one took a vote. No one signed a treaty. And yet, the world changed that weekend. The greatest trick of global power isn't control. It's irrelevance. If a system becomes big enough, it no longer needs permission to act. By this point, it wasn't about a hotel, or a meeting, or even a group. It was about a structure, so large, so embedded, that it stopped looking like a conspiracy and started looking like the weather. I noticed something strange in how these meetings evolved over time. In the early years, it was mostly politicians and economists, government figures, central bankers, military planners. But starting in the late 90s, something shifted. The guests changed. Now the room included big tech founders, behavioral psychologists, social media algorithm engineers, biometric ID consultants, climate think tanks, AI ethicists, pandemic modelers, strategic foresight officers from NATO and DARPA. What does that tell you? That the decisions being made, or aligned, were no longer about countries. They were about systems. The modern world doesn't run on nations. It runs on data, infrastructure, energy, financial pipelines, digital consensus. And those are not governed by flags. They're governed by networks. The same networks that Bilderberg attendees build, fund, and advise. I found an internal presentation leaked from a global banking consortium in 2015. It included a slide titled, Sovereignty Disintermediation. That's a complicated way of saying nations are no longer necessary to control outcomes. You don't need to topple a government. You just need to shape what people see, shape how money moves, shape what's acceptable in the narrative. And for all of that, you need consensus above governments, not within them. That's what Bilderberg became. Not a conference, a control room for a system that no longer needed borders to function. Let me give you an example. In 2009, a meeting was held in Greece. On the agenda, rebalancing global debt architecture. 6 months later, the Greek financial crisis exploded. Austerity measures were imposed. Suicide spiked. Protests rocked the streets. But here's what most people missed. The firms and institutions that rescued Greece were represented at the Bilderberg meeting. Before the collapse. Not after. Before. They didn't predict it. They prepared for it. Or consider the rise of digital identity initiatives post-2020. Suddenly, governments around the world began implementing vaccine passports, biometric ID, centralized health databases. The same infrastructure was discussed in closed-door forums years earlier by organizations with heavy Bilderberg overlap. Once again, the rollout looked national, but the plan was already global. And that's the game. Make decisions in private. Allow nations to announce them in public, as if it was their idea all along. No fingerprints, no paper trails, just trajectory. We used to think of power as something you could point at. A king, a president, a flag. But in the 21st century, true power doesn't look like a throne. It looks like a dashboard in Brussels, a data center in Utah, a back channel on Signal, a shared Google Drive where 6 people edit the future. And the reason you don't see it? Because you're looking for speeches. But this system doesn't speak. It aligns. It adapts. It absorbs. And when a new threat emerges, a war, a virus, a tech shift, this system doesn't panic. It pivots, because the architecture is already there. It was never about countries. It was about continuity. Continuity of influence. Continuity of compliance. Continuity of silence. You still think you're governed by your president? Or your parliament? Think again. One question kept gnawing at me. If all of this is real, the meetings, the patterns, the alignments, then why doesn't anyone talk about it? Where are the exposés? The whistleblowers? The documentaries? Sure, there are fringe websites, conspiracy forums, occasional YouTube rants. But where are the real journalists? The ones with credentials, access, platforms? Why does no one in mainstream media ever touch this? Then I found out something most people don't know. Bilderberg invites journalists. Every year, a few editors-in-chief, publishers, or senior correspondents attend the meetings. But here's the catch. They don't go as reporters. They go as participants. They agree, in advance, not to write about what they see or hear. It's not a suggestion. It's a condition. In 2010, Charlie Skelton, a writer for The Guardian, tried covering the meeting in Sitges, Spain. He wasn't even allowed past the security perimeter. He described being followed, questioned by plainclothes officers, and surveilled, all for standing near a hotel. In 2013, Glenn Greenwald tweeted about the media's silence during that year's Bilderberg summit. He said, "It's amazing how many powerful journalists are at Bilderberg, and how little coverage ever comes out of it." And then I found something even more disturbing. In 2015, a European Media Foundation held a closed seminar for new editors. One of the presentations was leaked. The slide was titled, "Strategic Silence, Maintaining Access in High-Level Networks." The bullet points included, discretion equals longevity. Disruptive coverage limits future influence. Alignment fosters credibility within elite circles. Let that sink in. Not censorship. Strategic silence. You see, it's not that the media is told not to talk. It's that they understand what happens when they do. They lose invitations. They lose access. They get pushed out of the inner circle, where stories are shaped before they're written. So they stay quiet, or they write safe summaries, or they ignore it altogether. Not because they're forced to, but because they've been trained not to see it as a story. And that's the brilliance of it. If you silence one journalist, it's oppression. But if you train a generation of journalists to ignore something, that's control. Invisible, elegant, unquestioned. Even the conspiracy label helps. Anytime someone brings up Bilderberg, they're mocked. Oh, that old myth. Come on, it's just a bunch of rich guys talking. But what if it's not? What if mockery is the firewall? The tool that keeps people from ever looking deeper? I started seeing it everywhere. A politician attends, no questions asked. A CEO flies in, no press coverage. A journalist enters the building and exits 3 days later with nothing to say. That's not journalism. That's compliance. And here's the irony. We think the press protects democracy. But in this case, the press is helping hide the fact that democracy was bypassed a long time ago. Power doesn't just hide behind curtains. It hides behind silence. And the ones who should be shouting are the ones who were invited in. At this point, the question stopped being about Bilderberg. It wasn't about one meeting, or one group, or even one agenda. It was about reality itself. Every time I traced a major shift, a war, a crisis, a reform, a revolution, I found fingerprints from before the event, before the media, before the public ever knew it existed. And those fingerprints always pointed back to the same kinds of rooms, same faces, same rotations of experts, same private briefings, same silence. And I started to wonder, what if we're not watching history unfold, but play out? Like a script, written in pieces, by people we never see, agreed upon before the curtain rises. Because think about it, when was the last time you changed something? Really changed something? When was the last time public outrage stopped a war, or reversed a policy, or broke a monopoly? When was the last time your vote moved the needle? You're allowed to choose between column A and column B. But who decided those were the only columns? Who chose the limits of the debate? Who framed the options before you even had a say? The more I looked, the clearer it became. We live inside decisions that were made long ago, not enforced, embedded. The systems that run the world, financial, technological, political, are structured to self-replicate. Once aligned at the top, they push change downward, disguised as policy, law, progress, or crisis management. You don't need to believe it. You just need to comply. And if you don't, well, the systems will still move without you. That's the genius of it. Real control doesn't require consent, just normalization. If you wake up inside a structure where surveillance is normal, war is permanent, fear is ambient, and silence is patriotic, you're not free. You're just well-trained. One former intelligence officer, anonymous, of course, once said, if the outcome is always the same, then the mechanism doesn't need to be visible. That line stuck with me, because we think visibility equals legitimacy. If I can see who's in charge, I can vote them out. But what if no one is in charge? Just a framework, a living machine made of protocols, meetings, handshakes, and people who no longer need to ask permission. That's what modern power looks like. Not a dictatorship, a consensus with no exit. And it's why every attempt to resist feels so small. Because we're not resisting people, we're resisting alignment. We live in a world that already knows where it's going, where the maps have already been drawn, where the paths have been paved in advance. The only choice left? Walk quietly, or ask the question that makes people uncomfortable. Are we living inside the decision? After everything I found, the documents, the patterns, the alignments, the names that never left the room, I came to a hard truth. Not a theory, not a suspicion, but a realization. The world we live in wasn't recovered from World War II. It was built from it. We tell ourselves the war ended in 1945. The bad guys lost. Freedom triumphed. But behind the headlines and flags, a different kind of operation began. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists into the U.S. Gladio built stay-behind networks in Europe with XSS officers. MKUltra experimented on citizens with tactics learned from interrogators. Bilderberg gathered the architects of the new world behind closed doors. The result? A post-war world built not on peace, but on controlled continuity. A world designed by survivors, collaborators, opportunists, many of whom were never supposed to return, and yet they did. They weren't punished. They were promoted. They didn't lose. They were recycled. Which brings us to the question no one wants to ask. What if they never left? What if the people, ideologies, and mechanisms we thought we defeated were never destroyed, just rebranded? What if the war wasn't the end, but the beginning of a more effective system? Not one that conquers cities, but one that conquers consensus. We've spent decades chasing villains, dictators, extremists, hackers, terrorists, but the true architects of modern power don't need revolutions. They don't need armies. They only need a format and obedience. And once you realize that, you start to see the real architecture, not on the news, not in the polls, not in the speeches, but in the silence, the compliance, the fact that nothing ever really changes, no matter who's in charge. Because change isn't what they fear. Unscripted change is. The kind that isn't aligned, isn't approved, isn't profitable. So they give us the illusion of choice, the theater of conflict, the ritual of elections. But the outcomes? They don't shift the machine, because the machine was never built to be changed, only to adapt. So now the final question isn't who are they? Or what are they doing? It's this. How long have we lived inside something we didn't even know was there? How many of our values, our dreams, our freedoms, are actually scripts we were handed a long time ago? We don't live in the world that came after the war. We live in the world they built from it. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became. Sometimes evil doesn't die. It just gets a new suit, a new invitation, a new meeting room. So now I leave the question with you. Can freedom survive in a world where obedience looks like progress? Or are we all just living inside a decision that was made long ago? Tell me what you think. Because maybe, just maybe, The truth is still being rewritten.